Okay. All right.
So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second series of the Future Food series organized by City University of Hong Kong and sponsored by Rabobank. Once again, thank you so much for visiting us online. This is the second event. For the first time visitors, welcome you. And for the second time visitors, thank you for being with us. And there will be more amazing events coming up, and stay tuned with us. So just like last time, we'll have a Q&A section. The question will be open at 10:15 a.m. So Hong Kong time. So if you have any question, feel free to leave it in the chat room and we'll address it at a later part. So without further ado, please allow me to welcome three heavyweight panelists and our beloved moderator, Sonali, Green Queen and the founder of Green Queen Media herself. So without further ado, I'll pass the time to the panelists and the moderator. Enjoy the time, please.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, and I appreciate that lovely introduction. I am Sonali Figueres. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Green Queen Media, and I think it's fair to say I spend most of my days thinking about the future of food. I think it's never been a more exciting time in the future of food. It's also never been a more appropriate time to think about the future of food. You know, just to kind of introduce this panel, we just had the third installment of the IPCC report come out about the climate, and even they were very clear in their writing that we must adapt and modify our global food systems in order to really deal with the current and continually impending climate emergency. So I think this is a really important conversation that we're about to have with some incredible human beings that have devoted their lives to really rethinking our relationship with animals and food. And I'm just absolutely delighted to be a moderator today. I'm going to introduce all the panelists, but I'm going to start with Varun Deshpande, who's my good friend and somebody I really enjoy debating the future of food with. He is the head of the Good Food Institute India and one of the leading voices for alternative protein in the world. Hi, Varun, how are you?
Hi, Sonali, thank you for having me, and I am well. It's early here in Mumbai. It's looking to be a good day. Thank you for having me again.
Thanks for joining us so early. We start this series in a very similar way to last time, which is that we have one question and we'd like to hear every panelist's answer to it. So I'm going to pose it to you. What do you believe is the answer to the future of food? What is your one solution?
Yeah, thank you, Sonali. Thanks for the question. And it's not going to surprise you to know that our answer, or my answer to the future of food, is advancing alternative proteins. And you already highlighted that with very many institutions that study these things day in, day out, like the IPCC, the UN FAO, and a number of different authorities on the subject, essentially saying that we're not going to solve climate without solving food and ag, and we're not going to solve food and ag without solving protein. This is a central question to what we're going to do on the future of food, right? So if we're going to feed 10 billion people by the year 2050, over half of whom will continue to live in Asia at that time, we really do have to figure out how to build a smarter protein supply, because a lot of the vast majority of the protein that we get today is from industrially farmed or fished animal sources, right? So we are using vast tracts of land, water, non-renewable energy, emitting vast effluents, greenhouse gas emissions, etc., to get very meager returns. And it's not just the climate issues, there are also very major public health issues that are emanating from this system, like zoonotic disease, antimicrobial resistance, a huge amount of challenges that we do need to address upfront. Sorry, I'm not sure what that noise is. Can you hear that loud, or is it fine?
Yeah, we can hear it, but I think it's temporary.
Sounds of Mumbai. Should I just keep going?
Sorry, keep going, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So, when we think about some of these challenges, the climate change implications, the public health implications of what we're doing right now, we do have to figure out a solution that actively stewards the health of this planet as well as public health, but still gives people what they want to eat, right? Because despite what we talk about here today, and despite all the panels that you and I have been on together, Sonali, and as well as Peter and Temple have been on, demand for meat is only going up. And in fact, it's driven by growing incomes and growing demand in this part of the world, in places like South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. So our solution is very simple. It's not telling people that they should be eating chickpeas instead of chicken or eating broccoli instead of beef, because that doesn't seem to work. It hasn't worked over the last decades, and it's very unlikely to work over the next decades. So our solution, along with everyone else in the alternative protein sector, is to advance foods that literally taste the same or better and cost the same or less as their animal-derived counterparts, but which happen to have vastly lower implications in terms of planetary health footprint, public health implications, etc. So that's really what we're focusing on. And we do it by working with universities, entrepreneurs, large corporations, governments, pretty much anyone that can help us formulate next generation meat, egg, and dairy products that are made from plants or cells or microorganisms. So they provide all the sensory and the cultural resonance of their animal-derived counterparts, but without breaking the planet any further.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me ask you a follow-up question. There was another report that's just come out, the IPES report. And in it, one of the arguments, is that the talk is too much about protein. So I want to ask you, as somebody who's a leader in alternative protein space, and of course, we're always told we need more protein. Are we spending too much time on the protein question? What about the rest of our diet?
Yeah, you'll have to excuse the sounds of Mumbai continuing in the background here, but I will say I actually really liked the IPES report, and there is no doubt that people are too fixated on protein, but the stance that we're taking as an organization and as an industry is just a pragmatic one. The idea here is that people are not going to want to eat less protein. As I said, in fact, the growth in demand for meat, eggs, and dairy is being driven to a great extent by rising incomes in places like India. And the reason for this is very simple. I mean, meat is delicious, right? It's also an aspirational food. It brings people together. This is a result that's proven over and over again in every country in the world. As incomes rise, people want to eat more meat. And a lot of that is just because it's an aspirational food and it's delicious, right? So I think reports like the IPES report, which essentially says we need to focus less on replacing meat and more on broader food systems reform, etc. I get asked those questions all the time, and frankly, I agree, right? I think that in addition to the work that we're doing, providing like-for-like replacements for beef burgers, which, by the way, Americans eat 3 beef burgers a week on average, which I love America, but for all sorts of reasons, that's just crazy town, right? That's really bad for the environment. It's really bad for public health. So it is hugely impactful to provide a like-for-like replacement for a beef burger that's made from plants. And an example of how impactful it is if you take just one of those 3 beef burgers a week on average and replace it with a Beyond Beef burger that's made from plants, that's the impact that you're having is essentially taking 12.2 million cars off the road or powering 2.3 million additional homes. So even just doing that is huge impact. But what the IPES report and people like that are saying is that we also need to create broader food systems reform, like integrate into agri communities, make sure that we're stewarding nutrition through these products, etc. And we agree. And the next phase of alternative protein work is exactly that. There's a lot of work and great research that's ongoing to do things like diversify the raw materials, work with smallholder farmers, make sure that the next generation of products have extremely high nutritional status. All of this work is already ongoing, right? So I appreciate the kind of alarm bells that are ringing from the likes of IPES, essentially saying we need to do more than just replace beef burgers.
Thank you, Varun. I really appreciate that, and a lot of food for thought, so to speak. I'm going to follow that up with the incredible Temple Grandin. Hi, Temple. I think you're on mute.
Okay, wonderful to be here. And I've been in the cattle industry, the cattle industry for 50 years, and I've been doing lots and lots of thinking about the future of meat. And I've traveled all around the world, and I've been on grazing lands in many places in the world. And I found out 20% of the Earth's surface is grazing land. And we have some very innovative small farmers. Okay, Varun, you talked about smallholders, but innovative people doing really good things with pasture rotation and rotating cattle with crops. And then you don't have to use such huge amounts of chemical. And if you do it right, you can actually improve the land. One of the big mistakes made with grazing is you don't give the roots of the plant enough time to regenerate. And I learned from agronomists, I've been talking to agronomists lately, that grazing livestock, wildebeest in Africa, bison in the US, created some of our best cropland. And you can use fencing systems to replicate that. But you got to do it right, because if you do it wrong, the cattle or the bison or whatever, they wreck the land. But there's a place for this now. And also, this is a type of farming that's not really industrial. And if you do it right, you can actually sequester carbon. I'm not going to discuss the other species. I'm going to just talk about the ruminants, the grazers, sheep, cattle, goats, the ruminant animals. Now, looking at some of the research on this, it takes 3 to 5 years to show an improvement in the soil health. Also, right now, fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. We're exporting gigantic amounts of soybeans and corn. A lot of that goes to feed pigs. We need to be raising some grazers every 3rd year on a cover crop, and then we wouldn't have to spray Roundup all over everything. This is getting the animals back with the land. And this is something we could do in many countries. One of the things we learned is big is fragile. That's what COVID showed us. As supply chains started breaking down, we had a horrible problem in our pork industry. 2 gigantic slaughterhouses shut down. They had to kill on the farm, sometimes really bad methods, 300,000 head of pigs in the upper Midwest, absolute mess. And I agree with you, Varun, about smallholder farmers, because a lot of this very innovative stuff is done by smaller farmers. We've got to get crops and grazers back together again. We've got to, also improve the land. That's something we do. We've got to do. And I've been getting interested in this. I've looked at a lot of literature. I'm only dealing with the grazers at this point, and that's not, real intensive agriculture. I think pig industry, and they've got the most problems with antibiotics that are getting out on the land, all kinds of things. We've got to cut down on the antibiotic use. I think in the future, in looking at some of these systems, you have our organic sector and say, well, you never use a chemical ever. You never use any drugs at all. That's all evil, bad stuff. I think in the future, what's going to work is a more hybrid system where we use a lot of organic principles. It's mostly organic, and you use little bits of chemicals and treat the few sick animals, because I've seen in some organic systems and disincentive to treat sick animals. That's not okay. But we got to drastically cut antibiotic use. There's things that are going to have to change. But I look at all this land. I've visited the outback of Australia. I've been to New Zealand. I've been to Uruguay. I've been all of the grazing lands, the Western United States, Canada, grasslands in the UK. I've been to these places. And if you do it right, you can actually sequester carbon, improve the land, but you got to do it right. I can't emphasize that enough. It's also going to be very local, because what works in one place does not work somewhere else. Very, very local. We've got to get away from monoculture. Monoculture only works in the short run. In the long run, you're going to get wrecked doing monoculture.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I think there's no doubt that regenerative agriculture and regenerative principles have a place in the future of food. I mean, I think it would be wrong to ignore its important place. But today, we are in a situation where 90% of our meat is from industrial cattle farming, right? And that has driven prices down, and it has driven consumption up. And you say we have to do it right. So how do we...
Wait a minute, it's just not just cattle farming. What about pigs?
Yes,
that's
yes,
probably the most. And I'm only talking here about grazers.
Yeah, I understand.
Only talking about the grazers. Yeah, there's a lot of problems with the industrial stuff. Well, we shouldn't be calf feeding in feed yards. They need to be out there grazing and feeding a lot less grain.
But how can we economically incentivize the industry to change?
Well,
because that means less meat.
Part of the problem is subsidies in different countries that actually incentivize not good behavior. And they incentivize getting away from diversified farming, which is something that we need to be doing. And if I have grazing animals out there, I don't have to buy all this artificial fertilizer. You see, this is,
so regulation.
Going back to the old way of farming. Also, the thing about a big supply chain, okay, when it works, it's very efficient. You can have safe food, but when it breaks, you're in trouble. That's one of the things COVID's taught us that.
So do you see regulation and government action as being a key part of this?
What I'm saying, where I have been able to make the most change is working with large buyers, working with very large food buyers to bring about change. When I started my career back in the 70s, I was all about legislation. Now I'm all about working with big buyers. They have the power to bring about huge change. And so that's who I work with. But we also have subsidy programs that incentivize stuff that's not very sustainable. Like, let's take our ethanol program right now. We were exporting ethanol and they're plowing up land they shouldn't even graze corn on. And we're feeding it to cars. You see, biofuels, there's a point where they're sustainable. They're sustainable up to a point. And then there's a point where they get unsustainable. When you start exporting biofuels, that's not sustainable. Putting it on a boat with a diesel motor, that's not sustainable.
And when you talk to some of these big suppliers, have you had conversations with them about regenerative practices?
Yes, I have. And what happens in any industry, I don't care if it's an electronic chip industry, little guys innovate in every industry. Because I've been in the industry now for a long time, like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, some of these rotational grazing and regenerative agriculture, it looked like it was ridiculous. That's the way people looked at it. Now it's things that were considered ridiculous 20 years ago are going mainstream right now. Okay, how about you feeding probiotics to poultry? 20 years ago, that was considered ridiculous, way out. And then just before COVID, I went to what we used to call the big poultry show. They had banners hanging down on the escalators about probiotics. And reducing the antibiotic use, there's been, some good progress on that. You see the problem, where you get in trouble with the antibiotic use, it's having going into the water supply and then the urine and the manure, you're putting it out on the land and it's mixing with the microorganisms in the soil and doing really weird things. I've read scary papers about antibiotic-laden poop on the soil. And that's where a lot of resistance is breeding. And then I had a hideous thing that happened in India where pharmaceutical factory was throwing their waste antibiotic stuff into the river. And there was a gigantic bunch of antibiotic resistance all around that plant in people. That's terrible. You can't just be dumping that stuff out into the environment. But on the other hand, a sick animal needs to get treated. So what the sensible thing to do is you cut them way down. Like right now, we got chicken producers that are now 90% antibiotic free. 90% of their birds are antibiotic free. And when they first started doing it, they had some gigantic messes. And then they had to learn management, like clean your hatchery trays really well, like really clean them.
Thank you, Temple. I really appreciate you sharing that, and certainly things I really want to come back to and look more at the literature. I am going to finish off with our third and esteemed panelist, Peter Singer. We're obviously completely going in a different direction where a lot of your work has really been around, removing animals from the food systems. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, certainly. And by the way, I'm pleased to be part of this interesting panel. My interest in this came from an ethics background. I was studying philosophy at the time and stumbled across the fact through a chance meeting that animals were being brought indoors and reared indoors in conditions that were basically to increase the profit of the producer, lower the costs, not at all really for the welfare of animals. And so this was over 50 years ago now, and something that I hadn't known about and that most people didn't know about. And I got into exploring the ethics of how we ought to treat animals. Why do we assume that our interests always override theirs? Why do we assume that they're basically means for our ends and that whatever will produce those means more efficiently from our perspective is going to be okay? And that seemed to me to be a completely unfounded attitude to animals. There's no justification for thinking that the pain of an animal counts less just because it's not a member of the species Homo sapien than a similar amount of pain would count if a human were experiencing it. And it's not just physical pain, it's also stress and suffering and boredom and discomfort and the whole range. And the more I looked into that issue, although of course there are a lot of areas where we abuse animals, ranging from animal research and circuses and entertainment and the fur industry, but the biggest of these by far was rearing animals, producing animals for food, and also by far the worst of these for the animals was intensive farming or confined animal, concentrated animal feeding operations, whatever you want to call them, bringing very large numbers of animals together, bringing them indoors, and essentially industrializing the production of animal products. And that most obviously was in the chicken and meat industry, chicken meat, chicken eggs, and pigs, as Temple has been saying. But it's also pretty industrialized in the dairy industry, where we have these huge dairy farms with many thousands of cows, not ever on pasture. And as far as cattle are concerned, the beef feedlot is certainly a similarly an intensive system. And now we have, in terms of numbers, and Varun mentioned this, actually the largest area of factory farming in terms of the number of vertebrate animals involved is the fish farming industry, confinement of fish in nets and cages. And although nobody quite knows the numbers, but the best estimate I've seen is that it would be around 100 billion animals raised and killed each year. And so these all have, I think, miserable conditions for the animals and are not justified for that reason. But also, as Temple and Varun have been saying, it's not a sustainable practice because we're growing food to feed to these animals, or in the case of the fish industry, we're catching wild, small, low-value wild fish, grinding them up and feeding them to the carnivorous fish, in particular the salmon, for example. And in all of these circumstances, we are taking more food and getting less food out by churning this food through an animal, whether it's more calories, more protein, however you want to put it. These are wasteful industries. And Francis Moore Lappé wrote that more than 50 years ago in Diet for a Small Planet, but it's still the case. It's still the case that we get less food value out, that it's very wasteful. And so in terms of sustainability, as well as in terms of reducing animal suffering, I think this is the #1 target. Now, should we try to end all commercial exploitation of animals for food? I think it's going to be difficult to have at least large-scale commercial exploitation that is compatible with ethical principles about how we ought to treat animals. But I basically agree with Temple that I think the focus anyway should be on ending industrial farming. And if there are some grazing lands that can be sustainably grazed, I'm not so troubled by that. That's certainly, it's not the priority for me anyway. Maybe in an ideal sense, we wouldn't want to do it, but from where we are now, the priority has to be ending intensive farming of animals.
Absolutely. But I mean, I think at this point, apart from, a few fringe groups, it's pretty clear to most people who are somewhat aware of the food system that industrial animal farming is cruel. It's it's negative. Okay, but if we look at the consumer and the demand and what this industry is doing, which is satisfying our ever-growing appetite for animal meat, right? You've got Varun who's saying, and the alternative protein industry that's saying, okay, consumers are eating these products and we need to give them, high fidelity alternatives to kind of one-to-one replace it, right? Then you've got what Temple is essentially saying is we've got to go to the producers and we've got to say, you can do better and here are ways to do better and work with them to improve the actual way that the animals are reared. But in terms of your work, there's this philosophical aspect to it, which is we need to rethink our relationship to animals and look at the ethics of it. And in many ways, I mean, certainly in my journey, I would say that is almost the hardest of the arguments, right? Because and that's what I really want you to speak to is can we get to a place where the majority of human beings are redefining their ethical relationship with animals?
Well, I don't know. I mean, having a philosophy degree doesn't mean that I have a crystal ball and can see into the future. So I can't answer really whether we will get.
Let me pose it to you in a different way. We have a rising generation of younger folks, especially Generation Z, where we're seeing, has historic levels of adaptation to vegan diets and wanting to really put the ethics of animal rights right at the center of their consumption choices. Arguably, there are more vegans today than any other time in the world. Certainly defining themselves that way, not because of a religious, tradition or belief. What do you think about that? I mean, it's a big change.
It is a big change, and it's a very encouraging sign, I have to say, that there are these people who are wanting to be vegan or close to it. And as a result of that, there are a lot more vegan products in stores that people can get. There are pretty much every restaurant that you go to, certainly in most major Western cities at least, will have vegan options on the menu, or you can ask for a vegan dish. So that's very encouraging. And I think that's going to make it easier. And I suppose to get back to your question that I said I can't really answer, but if we do get to a critical mass where a lot of people, doesn't have to be a majority initially, are vegan and are demanding vegan products, and they're everywhere, it's going to be just that much easier to actually really go further, significantly further. So I think that is possible in the West. I'm more concerned about Asia. I'm particularly concerned about China, because China just seems to be willy-nilly going ahead with building vast factory farms, multi-story factory farms with hundreds of thousands of pigs in a single building, and aquaculture as well, with huge numbers of fish. And it's not easy to see how that's going to stop in China, unless, perhaps this is where Varun's alternative proteins come in. If you really get proteins that taste as good, that people want just as much, and that can compete economically, maybe that's going to have an impact, even if we have people who really don't think very much about the ethics of how we're treating animals.
Right, which underlines the pragmatic nature of a lot of alternative protein kind of founders and companies. Well, thank you for that, Peter. We're going to move to the next part of the panel, where I'm going to ask kind of each of you, and starting with Varun, to comment on one of the other panelists' solution and kind of be in conversation with it. Varun, do you want to start?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Sonali, I'm actually going to comment on both Peter and Temple's comments. I think so. I mean, by the way, just a quick anecdote about what Peter said about aquaculture, right? Because aquaculture has been presented as a major solution to our protein needs, because seafood is really interesting. I mean, something like 50% of global seafood today actually comes from smallholders, and then the rest comes from deep sea fishing and trawling, which is extremely damaging, right? So this third source, which is aquaculture, which is essentially farming fish, as Peter said, has come up as this huge solution. Just a quick anecdote here. In October 2019, there's a Norwegian fishing giant named Moby. They have operations in the north of Canada. They do this huge salmon fishing. They announced that they had lost about 87% of their stock in the water, about 5,000 metric tons of salmon, because of a change in temperature in the water. And the rumor was that it's actually not because of a change in temperature, it's because of an outbreak of disease, right? 87% of their stock in the water. And this is one of the largest aquaculture fishing operations in the world. And if you just look this up, just Google, aquaculture, disease breakouts, etc., you will see disease outbreaks, you will see that this is par for the course, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are about 1,000 reasons to move away from industrial animal agriculture, right? The fact that it is a moral travesty in the 21st century is among the foremost of those. But then additionally, as Peter was saying as well, from a sustainability standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from so many angles, it just doesn't make sense to continue entrenching this system further and further, Meanwhile, what's happening is it continues to get entrenched further and further. So to talk about Peter's example of what's happening in China, I can tell you that I've been in government meetings in places like India as well, where quoting verbatim some of the government officials, they've said, we have not sufficiently exploited the waters under our jurisdiction to conduct fishing and aquaculture operations, right? So I think in terms of what we have to do to move forward and build a better food system, we really have our work cut out for us. And that's where kind of alternative proteins come in to try and present this economic alternative that could create millions of jobs, that could provide consumers and producers with something that they actually want to eat and produce, that is lucrative, that makes sense to them. But I don't necessarily think that this approach is incompatible with what Temple was saying, right? So I believe that regenerative agriculture and alternative proteins can work together. So as you said, Sonali, whereas regenerative agriculture could be a part of the future of food, of course, with very many small producers producing chickens or cows in ways that are vastly more humane, as well as vastly more sustainable than the industrial system currently allows. We could use the same lands that are being used to produce those animals to grow rotation crops for alternative proteins, etc. And some of these approaches are already being tried out in places like North America, as well as places like South Asia, right? So there's a lot of work we have to do, but these approaches are not incompatible with each other. What I've seen is that oftentimes people tend to try and shout over each other, and the regenerative folks tend to try and shout over the alternative protein folks, and vice versa. And I think there's a huge degree of partnership that is in fact possible, because we actually, as Temple's been saying, the farmer can be at the center of everything that we're doing, and we need to kind of work together to make that happen, right? So just to reiterate, I think if we're producing plant-based eggs from mung beans, and mung beans have been grown in places like India for 4,000 years, they can be grown in rotation with other crops that could then be used for other industries, right? So there's a lot that we can and should be doing to ally with these different movements, so that we at least are presenting a united front, because really what we're trying to do is provide an alternative to industrially farmed animal meat, which is one of the most damaging systems that has existed ever in history.
I appreciate that perspective, and I do think that, you know, as someone who's in this industry every day, I am worried about a growing backlash happening, or a factioning happening, and this is happening across many industries and across many parts of our society. But once again, it for me, and this is something I always say when I speak about it, is it's not alternative protein or animal protein right now. It's really going to be both for a long time, and then we see where we go. But I think, you know, there are no silver bullets. Do you agree with that, Varun?
I agree that there are no silver bullets. It's difficult not to be a little bit hammer and nail. We do think that alternative proteins are among the solutions that address most, if not all, of the challenges that we're facing today in the food system. But the way that we're defining it is that alternative proteins are not a techno patch on the problems of the planet. They need to be integrated with the agri supply. We need to work with smallholder farmers. We need to, and to be clear, Sonali, you and I have talked about this so often. We're doing things like this in places like India, right? I mean, it would be totally churlish of me to say, let's not work with the agri supply in a place like India that has these fantastic agroclimatic zones, that has 50% of our population dependent on agriculture for their livelihood and sustenance. So we're working with, let's say, agricultural universities to analyze mung beans and other pulses and millets and hemp and pongamia and all of these fantastic crops for inclusion in the alternative protein sector, so that we can provide a lucrative end market for those crops, so that the other movements that are taking place within agriculture also have a fast growing industry into which to sell to, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for complementarity, as you say, Sonali, but we do think that alternative proteins, which we call smart protein, by the way, in India, because it's just a smarter way to produce protein, are one of the as close to silver bullets as possible as you can get.
Absolutely. And I think one other thing that is often kind of misexplained is that alternative proteins are not just one thing. Not everything is an Impossible Burger. And I think that sometimes it's brushed, everything gets brushed with the same kind of everything is given the same brush is what I meant to say. Temple, is there a kind of some of what was said that you wanna go into discussion with?
Yeah, I
or
want to
comment
go
on?
into some things. I've tried eating a totally vegan diet, and I've got a metabolism. I cannot be on a totally vegan diet. Cannot function. And I don't have to have a pound of steak every day, but I've got to have a little bit of animal protein every day. So let's say they got rid of all the animals. Well, then I guess we'll have to grow meat cells in a bioreactor, because that's what I'm going to need. I simply cannot function. And there's a certain percentage of the population that's going to have difficulty. And there's some people that function just fine on a vegan diet. Differences in the metabolism. I agree with some of the problems with intensive farms. I think pigs and dairy cattle have got, they've got some of the most significant problems. I don't like these low buildings where it's just totally fan ventilated, no natural ventilation. I'll tell you why they build those buildings. Contractors love to build them because they don't need a big crane to put up the roof. They make more money building a building. I spent 25 years in heavy construction. So things like sow gestation stalls, that got started because contractors made a ton of money on shop fabricated steel. I can remember in the 70s, we didn't have sow stalls. And then these big contracting companies came in, they sold that to the investors, and the contractors make a mint on those sow stalls because they can build them in a steel shop and the weather doesn't shut them down. Yeah, that's one of the things that drove some of that stuff. No, I think sow stalls need to go away. Also disease, and there's been disease in fish that was brought up. African swine fever is a horrible mess in China. Avian influenza is going through the United States right now and killing all kinds of chickens. The thing is, big is fragile. And what we need to be doing is more diversified farming. See, what's happened is our crop farming is totally specialized, super big equipment. Everything's gotten specialized. We got to get the land and the farming back together. Let's say somebody's raising some chickens. Let me put the chicken manure out on that land. And you do this right, you can improve land. I've gotten really interested in sustainability. No, you have some great big place and it's dumping a whole lot of waste out there. No, that's not good. You see, but the paradox is in anything, I don't care if it's electronic chips or it's potato chips, is that a concentrated supply chain is very efficient, very cost effective with economies of scale. A more distributed supply chain is more robust. It doesn't break as easily, but it will be more expensive, but it doesn't break. I mean, COVID, one thing that's done, it's taught that lesson. And we had some big floods here. And that's when people started thinking about supply chains, when they start seeing the stores getting stripped. Then people get scared. Well, we're very lucky, at least in the, like the US, we don't have to get our food in a shipping container, thank goodness. There's some countries that do.
Indeed.
And figuring out better farming things, but we've got to get into the diversity. Biodiversity is good, whether it's in my microgut right here, or it's in the growing crops, or if it's in the rainforest. I'm learning more and more. We need to get crops and animals together, and that can be done in much
Temple,
Temple,
have you managed to get yourself to get to try some of the early prototypes of cellular meat?
I haven't. To be perfectly honest, I haven't. But if I had to, if I totally give up, meat from live animals, I would have to eat cellular protein, because the Impossible Burger, that's not going to do it for me. I simply cannot function.
We're going to need to get you to.
I don't know. There's a certain percentage. My mother's the same way. She's
Varun,
exactly the same way.
Varun, we need to get Temple to visit Upside Foods. Am I right?
Well, I have to eat some of the.
Taste some
Now we're
chicken.
going to have to look at our. Okay, now we have a big bioreactor in a huge factory, and it gets a disease in it.
So can I address that, Sonali?
I don't care what the
Yes,
system
yes.
is.
Go ahead,
Big,
Varun.
I didn't say big was bad. I
No.
said it is fragile.
You said big and fragile. So I agree with you. I think, and you're right, Temple. I mean, look, just being pragmatic about this, the initial approaches to scale up all of these new technologies will take a scale up approach, right? But there will also be a scale out approach for exactly the reason that you're laying out, Temple, right? So we don't want a new system that's fragile, right? So there is going to be there are in fact a lot of approaches in research and development that relate to building out networks of much smaller cultivators to produce cultivated meat, rather than these massive ones that might have a bunch of issues. And by the way, you can't check every chicken or every cow for disease, but you can check every cultivator for off-spec parameters, right? So you can check to make sure that there isn't anything in there that doesn't need to be in there, which is part of the huge attraction of moving to this new system. So we're definitely on the same page on that, Temple, and we should, I agree, Sonali, get you out, Temple, to try some of these foods.
And
Let's
then
try.
you're gonna have to put your bioreactor, you can make a little unit fit in a shipping container, because that's sort of the standard unit of transport. They have a vaccine factory now that's fitting in shipping containers. You know, then you could move it around.
Well, I think we need some of your expertise for bioreactor lab design.
Well,
Your new area of
well, we've also got people raising food in high-rise greenhouses. This is strictly vegan. I'm talking lettuce and tomatoes. There's some regular vegetable crops in high-rise greenhouses. Let me tell you one thing they're going to have to do to keep disease out of those. I've worked on enough equipment in the shop that you can't clean that equipment. When you take it apart, it's like black grunge in there. So to keep disease out, like if I have one warehouse where I'm grilling lettuce in a city, then the following year, it's got to have a new crop in it that doesn't share any pests with lettuce. And then the following year, I put something else in it, where that lettuce is only grown every third year in that warehouse. And then another warehouse would be on a different cycle on the other side of town, preferably, so it doesn't share employees. Because a bioreactor is smooth, I can clean that. But that other kind of equipment, we've taken enough of that stuff apart in the shop. I'm going to be going out to the airport tomorrow, driving right by that shop. We've taken stuff apart in that shop, and you can't clean some of that stuff that well.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that insight. I just want to get Peter's views, Temple and Varun's sharings. Peter, what comes to mind listening to all this?
Well, it's been a really interesting discussion. As far as what Varun is saying, I certainly hope that all of this is successful, because I do think it could at least reduce significantly the amount of intensive farming and replace a lot of that product if it is. But it's really got to compete economically, it seems to me. And although we do have these products, Varun mentioned Beyond Meat and been mentioning the Impossible Burgers, you know, they're still more expensive than hamburger, and that's a problem. Now, part of that might be, as Temple correctly said, that the hamburger meat is subsidized, and particularly for the feedlots that are feeding grain to cattle, which again is a really inefficient.
The feed is subsidized. The feed is subsidized.
Exactly.
Not the feedlot. The feed. And
yeah,
a
exactly.
lot of that feed's being exported.
Right, but that means that the producers of that beef can compete more easily than they otherwise would with what you're looking for, right? Because you're interested in grass-fed beef, and the grass-fed, because they're not feeding any grain to the animals, they don't get that subsidy. So in fact, it's the feedlot operators who are getting a handout from the taxpayer to produce their beef, and the grass-fed ones, who I agree are, you know, both better for the animals and more environmentally sustainable and actually producing a healthier product, are not getting that subsidy. So
well, let's just I want to look at another thing on the Impossible Burger. I've looked at the ingredients list, and you got to remember, every ingredient has a supply chain that involves diesel trucks and things like that. That all has to be factored in.
yeah, it has to be factored in, but it may still turn out to be a lot less than cattle, because cattle are producing.
I think eventually, I mean, I'm never been a fan of calf feeding cattle, taking like real lightweight calves and feeding them out in the feed yard.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that's I've never really liked that. You know, I think sort of in the future, I think we're going to get some hybrid approaches, some really innovative hybrid things. Use a lot of organic principles, cut down on the amount of cattle feeding, but still maybe feed them just a real short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it seems politically extremely difficult to get those subsidies stopped or reoriented so that they're both, going towards more environmentally sustainable production
Well, I'll
as
tell you
well as
what's
more
gonna-
animal friendly.
What forces a lot of stuff is COVID, things like COVID, where you have a disease come through it and then you makes you change stuff.
You would hope so, but I'm not sure that it's happening. I mean, you correctly mentioned, and I was also horrified by this, the horrendous depopulation of, you said 300,000 pigs, but my understanding is it was probably over 1 million, although there was only one.
I'm just
pig
talking
collector.
about the one place in the upper Midwest in the US.
Right. I'm familiar with that.
Pigs. And I have a paper online on animal welfare problems in the pork industry and in COVID. And
right,
they had no
okay.
place to slaughter those pigs. It was horrible waste of food. They were killed in very many of them not nice ways. It was just horrible.
Well. Let's be out there. Basically, they were heated to death, right? I mean, the
No,
ventilation
they
was
were
cut
just
off.
wasted. 300,000 head of pigs were wasted. That was horrible.
Yeah.
Completely.
So I mean, this is certainly a problem that we build these huge industrial systems, and then when something goes a little wrong in the
break.
supply chain, we
Well,
have
it's
no
true
idea
for
what to
that.
do really.
It's true for other things too. We're building electronic chip factories right now.
Okay.
Yep. Like you want all the little gadgets to work in your car. Yep. I'm gonna need them. They're not potato chips. And that supply chain right now is getting more distributed because I'm following a lot of business stuff and I'm seeing parallels here.
Interesting.
And that supply chain, when we build those chip factories, they're gonna be more expensive, those chips. But we'll have them.
Well,
You don't have to worry about a factory breaking somewhere. Like the pigs broke.
Yeah, but there's not going to be the same suffering, right? The chips don't
No,
suffer.
it won't be suffering.
No,
It won't be suffering because maybe we don't need to. Certainly don't need some smart thermostat in your home. That's not something you need.
No, and I
There's a
used
lot
to
of
drive a
things
car
you don't
before
need.
there was ever any computers in the cars. Yeah.
Well, I can remember that too. And there are some very innovative people in the States and in other countries with doing really good integrated farming with livestock, even sometimes some pigs involved in it, and crops and grazing, where you're improving land, sequestering carbon. This is, and the little guys innovate. Let me tell you another thing that needs to be done. You got to write about it. You got to write about how to do these things. Like I've done a lot of stuff on improving cattle handling. When I first started, I wrote about the stuff. You write about how to do it, some little thing. Some of the farming stuff's getting bigger in New Zealand. I don't like some of the stuff I'm seeing there. Big is very economical.
Well, that's interesting because we have a very interesting question around this topic. So we're going to move into the questions from the audience part of the discussion, and we have a gentleman called Nigel.
And what was your question around this topic? You said there's been a lot of questions around this topic. What were they?
Mine personally?
Yeah.
Well, my personal, what I'm saying is that we've spent a lot of time on, not questions, on comments on scale and what happens when you scale. And a lot of this discussion has revolved around the issues of scale. And there's a fellow in the question and Q&A that is asking, can we find alternative routes towards cost efficiencies that are beyond scale?
All right, let me talk about some things about scale. Okay, right now, when COVID hit in the US, I got all these people calling me up. They visit our university to learn how to build small plants. Ranchers that want to sell right to the public. And it's going to be a more distributed supply chain. Now, the only way that rancher can compete in the small place against a big place is to have a niche, like local, family ranch or something like that. It's going to be like our beer industry. We have a very interesting beer industry. We got a gigantic Budweiser plant, and then we're all around the little craft breweries that put out the little craft beers. They're really expensive. Now, when COVID hit, they converted them to hand sanitizer. Okay, so let's say we build a lot of smaller places, and they're going to have a niche. You're going to have to have a specially niche. You cannot compete head to head with the big plant. And if something breaks, they just convert to regular. And you have a distributed supply chain. Right now, I've probably talked to like 15 people that are building small plants right now. And COVID triggered that.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Thank you. We've got two students that have some questions, so we're going to go them, and then there's some other questions in the Q&A that we will answer for Varun and for Peter. So stay tuned.
Peter is proving especially popular in the Q&A, so
yes,
you're welcome to type out your questions in the Q&A. I would like to introduce two students. The first, excuse me, is a secondary school student from Renaissance College. We're pleased that we have secondary school students and university students joining us. And over to you, Markandeya, to ask a question.
Hello. Sonali, I'm not able to start my video. It says the host has stopped it.
Cherry, if you could reset that for, there you go.
Okay, cool. Hello. So thank you very much for your exciting insights into the future of food. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say. My question is essentially about the idea of a vegan and a vegetarian diet being environmentally friendly. So I think a lot of people are actually aware of the significant environmental benefits of a vegetarian diet. In fact, a few years ago when I was from primary school, I did a survey within my own school about how aware people were of vegetarianism, and over 74% of my classmates were fully aware of the various environmental and health benefits vegetarianism brought with it as a diet. But we still see that very few people, particularly in Hong Kong where I am, are willing to switch to a vegetarian diet. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of the unpopular connotations a vegetarian diet has. So a lot of the perception around a vegetarian diet is that you eat almost like an animal, like you purely eat like lettuce or carrots every day. And while that isn't true, obviously, that's still something that a lot of people think of when they think of a vegetarian diet. It's also because of the inelastic demand for meat, as some of you pointed out, how people are almost addicted to meat and consuming it on a daily basis. So what do you think are some ways we can change the perception of vegetarianism and educate people about such a lifestyle beyond just it being environmentally friendly?
If that's directed at me, I'll have a go. I think you need to get people interested in it and used to it and trying it. Obviously, it's not all about lettuce or salads, although it's great to eat quite a lot of veggies. But after all, the traditional vegetarian diets, even before we have new alternative proteins, there's things like dal and rice, which is a great vegetarian meal. One of my favorite recipes, and one of the things that becoming vegetarian got me into was a bit more Indian cuisine that I hadn't really cooked before, but wasn't that difficult. And that's true of almost any cuisine. If you want a Chinese cuisine, then there's obviously tofu, and there are delicious dishes with tofu and eggplant and so on. If you want to cook Szechuan mapo tofu or something like that, I don't think anybody would consider that to be just a vegetable dish or a dish that's not adequate. And so there are dishes in any cuisine, and I think people should build on that and start with that and move on. But certainly, eventually, alternative proteins will play a role in extending the variety of vegan products, and possibly eventually then cellular meat will as well. Although that's then no longer vegetarian or vegan, but it doesn't have the ethical drawbacks of coming from an animal who's been badly treated in order to make the flesh or milk of that animal as cheap as possible. So I think there's lots of options for vegetarian, vegan, and just generally more ethical diets that can be fulfilling, sustaining, tasty, and really interesting to prepare.
Varun, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to add a quick plug for, I think media entities like Green Queen and others do play a big role, right? In terms of making it clear that there are very many options on this planet from a vegetarian standpoint that can be fun, that can be sexy, that, if you'll excuse my use of the word, that can be exciting to cook with. I mean, I don't know if you've ever bitten into a really delicious, juicy mango or a papaya, or had a really nice, as Peter was saying, dal rice meal. So there's plenty of options for people to eat vegetarian and have a really healthy, balanced diet. But even as Peter was saying, and as Mark laid out, I'm grateful actually, Mark, for the question, because it actually summarizes the theory of change here very well, which is we can ask people to eat chickpeas, not chicken, all we want, but it doesn't seem to work. For that center of the plate where people are craving chicken or steak, we really do have to try and give them exactly what they want from the perspective of something that tastes the same or better and costs the same or less. And that seems to replicate all over the world, even in a place like India, which people obviously assume India is highly vegetarian and not at all meat eating. All the consumer research we've done, including theoretical, focus group, tastings, etc., consumers are telling us that they want to be marketed to on the basis of the juiciness of the plant-based meat and the fragrance and how it fits into their their Sunday treat chicken curry meal or whatever, right? So they really, really want the taste and the juiciness and the experience of meat, which is really what the theory of change for the alternative protein sector is. Could I, Sonali and Justin, also address the question from Nigel, because the question about scale, just in 30 seconds?
And yes, sure. But also you have a follow-up question that I'll just put through to you, because then we'll move on to the others, which is from a Hong Kong-based chef, Richard Ekabis, who's basically asking you, it's really interesting because you kind of answered it, but he's basically saying a lot of the efforts in alt protein development aim to be similar in taste and texture as animal protein. As a transition for meat eaters, this is a solution. But when eating tofu, you eat soybean with the taste of soy and a huge spectrum of textures, flavors, and forms. Should we not explore this further with other types of legumes instead of predominantly looking for meat replacing alternative proteins? So this, you kind of already answered it, but make it a follow-up to your point about scale.
Yeah, and I mean, let me address that one up front. I think it's entirely possible for some proportion of occasions that people wanted to eat meat to replace that meat with something that doesn't taste like meat, right? So to have a delicious tofu dish that is the center of the plate on that occasion, that makes people feel like, oh wait, I did not even miss my meat on this occasion. But reliably and scalably, for everyone to feel like they have a true replacement, it seems like we need to get to really, really high fidelity meat replacements. This seems to be bearing out over and over again, theoretically, practically, etc., across various socioeconomic strata, across geographies. This seems to be the case, that we do need to provide something that tastes the same or better. But again, to the points made earlier, as well as to this question, yeah, I think there's a huge amount of work that we can do to provide delicious vegetarian, non-meat-like alternatives that can replace some proportion of that consumption, right? And then just to the point that Nigel made about scale, he's actually offered an alternative where he says there are open source approaches that have shown that you can drive down, for example, the price of insulin. So could we think about doing the same thing in the alternative protein sector? And yes, 100% agree, Nigel. You may know that we at the Good Food Institute globally fund a lot of research that we stipulate has to be open access. So we work with universities, governments, etc., and we fund a ton of research on alternative proteins and the biggest open scientific questions on it. But we're just a small network of nonprofit organizations, right? So if we've been able to work with donors and fund $6 million worth of research, we think governments should be funding orders of magnitude higher research dollars than we are able to fund ourselves, right? So there's a huge amount of work still to do here. And in countries, for example, like Japan and Korea and mainland China and India and Singapore, etc., there's still a huge opportunity to raise the state of science in the industry to a level that we can actually not have these questions anymore, right? Where if we're creating something that is truly a high fidelity replacement for meat, that is available, as Peter said earlier, at the price that people want to pay for meat, that's going to be something that's truly a game changer, but we're a little ways away from that. And the value of funding science and open access approaches is very high towards that path.
We have one, thank you, Varun. We have one more student who would like to go on video and ask a question. After that, we're going to turn to the Q&A box. I think I saw Temple's eyes and Peter's eyes moving towards that box. You can certainly read over that, but we'll be in the good hands of Sonali, who will guide us through those questions. But if you do see something you want to respond to, of course, please do pipe in. Can I now introduce Navi, who is an undergraduate student at City University of Hong Kong, who has a question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for a very heated and insightful panel discussion. I enjoyed it a lot. And my name is Navi, and I'm from the Department of Asian and International Studies in CityU. And I come from Cambodia, which is a very conservative country in the world where like people only like to listen to what they want to hear. Especially those in power, because they want to enjoy the luxury that they have right now. And they just overconsume, you know, they go to omakazes, they enjoy eating at high-end French restaurants or Japanese A5 Wagyu beef. And they also serve like shark fins soups in wedding ceremonies to prove their status. So my question for the panelists is that what should I say or do to, you know, show to the people who choose to be ignorant of this social and environmental about the issues that are resulted from the current health and environmentally damaging food system. And what do I, as a female Cambodian student, in a conservative, growing up in a conservative country, need, like, what do I need to do to inspire more people to embrace a sustainable food system going into the future?
I want to just make a comment. One thing I found, I've been able to improve cattle handling. And cattle handling in the 70s was really, truly terrible. And it's a lot better now, is pick out some particular thing. All right, shark fin soup at weddings. Just sort of get a grassroots things going where people shouldn't have that at their weddings. No, that's just terrible. You cut the fin off the shark and the shark dies. Is horrible. But start with something where it's more targeted, like the shark fin soup, and just you know, talking to people. Let's not serve that at weddings. You see, and I think you're going to get more done by picking out something like that that's relatively targeted than just going after saying, well, the whole food system's terrible.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with Temple on that. I think start with something that's winnable, and you know, work up from there and try and get a group of people behind you. And don't worry about the fact that you're young and female in a conservative society. I'm sure that, you know, if you speak out, you'll have an impact. And I think it's going to take a new generation of people in Cambodia to make those practices unacceptable. But it does happen. You know, we've seen it happen with quite a lot of changes, that people speak up and then other people realize this is not a good thing and we don't really need it. And as you say, maybe it was just a status thing that people were doing this. So let's move away from it. And, you know, once you've had some victories like that, then maybe you can start to move on and think about other issues that are more widespread, that are going to have a larger.
Picking out something specific, you know, in the work that I did, all the stuff I've done, I worked on improving cattle handling and cattle handling facilities. That's not the whole industry. Well, that's not the whole food, everything. It's something specific, and you pick out something more targeted and do it in a positive way. You know, don't say, well, you know, people that serve that at their weddings are terrible people. Just work on with other young people like you that this is, maybe we should stop serving this at weddings. No, because that from a cruelty standpoint is really terrible. It's totally wasteful. You cut the fin off the shark and the rest of the shark just dies and in pain. So it's also extremely wasteful of food. You know, that's something that, and I don't think people even think about that. You know, and you kind of just start out on, you know, one person says, well, you know, like, well, I didn't serve it at my wedding, and you work on something more targeted where you can actually make a change without just saying, well, the whole food system's terrible.
Yep. In Hong Kong, there has been a lot of really, really fantastic work done to limit and decrease the consumption of shark fin, and in many cases has resulted in bans. So maybe you might want to look at some of the shark activist groups in Hong Kong and their work there for kind of suggestions and ideas. Because it is an integral part of the culture here, the Cantonese culture, and it has, there's been some really great progress there. Just in the interest of time, I'm gonna move on to some of the questions in the Q&A. So thanks again, Navy, for that great question, and all the best as you try to inspire those around you. And I do also believe that one of the trends we see at Green Queen is that the Generation Z, as it's called, is a much flatter generation, in the sense that no matter where they are in the world, they seem to share some fundamental values. So there's a power in that. You're not isolated. You're part of a much broader global movement of changing consumption and changing behavior. So I think take some solace in that, and rely and look for support from your peers in other countries. Peter, we've got a couple questions for you from one of the audience around, this is going into a more philosophical tone. The audience member, and I'm sorry, I don't know if it's a lady or a man, but Med Sharan is from India. And Peter, you essentially made this person go vegan. And one of their non-vegan friends argues that we don't have free will, and that implies that the whole idea of morality is a fad. And if we don't have any free will, how can we be held responsible for anything that we do? And this person would like to know, how do they answer this?
I don't think it's true that we don't have free will in the relevant sense, right? I mean, the discussions of free will sometimes are talking about, well, suppose that you knew all the laws of science and you knew absolutely everything about the current state of the universe, the position of every atom or whatever. Could you predict the future? And maybe you could, but that's not very relevant for us making our choices here without anything like that knowledge, of course. So we do make choices. I think what people who say there's no such thing as free will and therefore no moral responsibility forget is that we are in a situation where we make choices, and we're conscious of being able to make that choice. I was conscious when I first became a vegetarian of being able to make the choice to not eat meat, or to continue to eat it. Some, omniscient being might have said that that was predictable from something about my background or circumstances, but it certainly wasn't for me. So I think you should really just tell that friend that you and your friend have to make choices, and you should make them on the best ethical principles you can, so as to reduce the amount of animal suffering, to make the planet sustainable, to enable people to feed themselves and have flourishing lives. Those are all things that you can take into account in the choices you make. And I think that's the only thing that really matters in terms of taking moral responsibility for what you do.
Thank you. A little follow-up from the same questioner. What are your thoughts on antinatalism? I mean, is letting the human race go extinct the solution to everything?
No, I don't think it is. I'm not an antinatalist. I think that it's not that nature is ideal either. And I think over the long term, it's better if our species continues, and if we try to improve things the way things are, from the way things are now. I'm not pessimistic enough to think that that's so completely hopeless that we ought to just let our species become extinct. Doesn't seem to me the solution at all. Thank
you, Peter. I appreciate it. We've got a question for Temple from Chef Ekibus again. He says he only sources ethical proteins, so meat raised without growth hormones, antibiotics, free roaming, preferably organic, but there is very little choice in the market, and the prices are significantly higher, which gives the farmer a better return. So how come we can't get more farmers to enter this space?
Well, actually, in the US, we've got a lot of farmers that have gone into it. We've got some very big companies going into it. Now, the thing I get worried about going totally antibiotic free because of sick animals not getting treated. And I'm just looking at it strictly from how can I design a system that will work. And I think in the future to get something that's going to be decent that people can afford, it'll be mostly organic with a little, occasional sick animal treated, little bit of artificial fertilizer. You don't ban Roundup, but you cut the use of it way, 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 way down. And then you kind of get the best of both worlds. And there's been quite a few people, farming experts, that have said that, and that would bring the costs down. Now, the other thing you've got to do is really audit programs. I've done a lot of work with buyers such as McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King on auditing meatpacking plants to make sure they stun cattle correctly, make sure that they're not poking them with electric prods. And you have to audit a system. You have to make sure the farms are doing what they say they're doing on the label. There was an article that just came out in the brand new Science saying that, some people were cheating basically on things like antibiotic free. And this is where buyers come in, and they can really enforce the rules sometimes in a way that legislation can't. But you have to constantly monitor stuff. And I've trained auditors. You have to have very simple guidelines that people can follow. Because if it's not simple, then then people can't do it. But simple guidelines. But what I find in the food marketplace here is that food industries come out in all kinds of products. You can go into our more natural type of grocery stores. I can't believe the products they got in there, and they're getting it down in price somewhat. But the thing that might be actually the best is it's mostly organic, a little bit of regular might actually be the best way to go. Use a little bit of regular. You might use a Roundup just once in a while, but most of the time you don't. And the antibiotics cut way down, way, way down. But you get some sick animals, you got to treat them. And they're going to have to be sold in the marketplace. But you're keeping it at a very, very low level.
Thank you. I hope that was great for the questioner. Next up, we've got a question for Varun around you mentioned obviously that alternative protein isn't the only solution to ensuring food security, and that there are other paths, like we also need to look at regenerative agriculture. So
we have to be doing regenerative agriculture. The other thing, I can tell you one thing we should not be doing: making milk out of almonds. We have that product. That almond trees are huge water pigs. They use lots and lots and lots of water, and to make milk out of almonds, that just doesn't make any sense. Oats makes some sense.
Okay.
Almonds don't.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So Sophie asking Varun, how do we incentivize the two sectors to merge?
So I think Temple in her previous answer mentioned something that, so the market and demand and buying can actually move the needle sometimes in places where regulation cannot go, or faster than regulation can, right? And of course, there are certain incentives and regulatory fixes as well to a lot of these things. But from the perspective of alternative proteins and the agri-supply and regenerative agriculture, etc., working together, I'll just push back to or pull back to another example that I had offered earlier. Some of the work that we've been doing at GFI India or GFI APAC has been to investigate and then practically explore how we can integrate backwards into the agri-supply. So things like looking at whether crops like hemp and millets and different types of pulses can come in and diversify the inputs for alternative proteins, right? So a lot of the products that are out there in the alternative protein landscape are made from soy protein and pea protein because these are the largest commodity crops. Soy is one of the largest commodity crops, mainly because of the animal industry, because it's used as feed for the animal industry, etc. So soy is out there, it's one of the hugest commodities, but what we can do is diversify and grow locally and do all the things that Temple's talking about from a regenerative standpoint, right? So some of the research that we're doing, for instance, is to investigate whether we can use different varietals of millets in alternative protein products like plant-based meats and dairy, etc. And as everyone probably knows, crops like millets are inherently sustainable. They are nitrogen fixing. They're grown very abundantly in these parts of the world, like South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. but we need to know more about them. We need to know how they can be utilized in innovative food applications. So we're doing research on things like the genomic, agronomic, food science parameters of these crops. Now, I'm not a food scientist, I just play one on TV, but the idea is that we're evaluating how they would perform in an end product like a plant-based egg. And the idea here is very simple, right? Governments have been trying to get people, farmers, especially smallholder farmers, to switch over from cash crops and grow these other sustainable crops like pulses, millets, etc. Right? But as Temple said earlier, you really need buyers to come in and need to buy that produce. Otherwise, the farmer is not going to necessarily switch over because they're not incentivized to do so. So to answer the question very directly, we think that fast-growing innovative industries like alternative protein, if they create a lucrative end market for all of these crops, that is automatically a complementary linkage between the regenerative world and the alternative protein world. And that's already happening, which is fantastic. But there's a lot more work still to do on the research and the value chain building and the entrepreneurial side of all of this.
Great. Thank you for that. We have two more questions. We have one comment that I will share from Cindy who says that she wants to share with Mr. Singer that you've been doing a very impactful job for animals, and that she and her best friend turned vegetarian after reading your book, Ethics in the Real World. So thank you for making the world better. It seems you've influenced many of the younger generation, Peter.
Thanks, Cindy, that's great.
Wonderful, it is, absolutely. There are two last questions, and they're interesting because they're a similar question. One is for Peter with regards to China, and one is for Varun with regards to India. And basically the question is this, and I'll pose it to both of you, and feel free to both respond. Do you believe that plant-based protein, alternative protein, can overtake meat in China? And in India's case, is it possible for India to leapfrog over large-scale meat consumption and go from the smaller quantities of meat per capita compared to, let's say, in the US, right into alternative proteins? And if so, what does that transition look like?
Yeah, so as far as China is concerned, again, I'm clearly no expert on China. I think the question said something about alternative proteins being mentioned in the 5-year plan, which I had noticed. And that's a good thing, but my understanding is that, in fact, it takes more than a mention in the 5-year plan to make something happen. That the government has to start really doing things to ensure that this happens, to put money into them or to promote them in some way. And so far, I'm not aware that this has happened in China. But really, Varun would be better placed in any case to answer that question than I am.
Thank you, Peter. I think, look, so we are cautiously optimistic about what's possible in China, right? And just to underline Peter's point, I think designating alternative proteins a strategically important industry of interest in China would be truly transformative. So just to give an example of some analogous industries, the reason that renewable energy is viable today is because China decided to get involved and significantly drop the price of all the components that go into these solar PV modules, right? So something like 70-80% of all solar modules are manufactured in China today. 70-80% of the world's solar modules are manufactured in China. It's an indication of how, when that country gets involved in a new industry, they can make it viable through scale and through just very deliberate decision making in ways that basically no other country on this planet can do, right? And so that's what we're hoping will happen in alternative proteins, and there have been some early positive signs to that effect. So in addition to the 14th 5-year plan making mention of cultivated meat and fermentation derived proteins and plant-based proteins, Premier Xi Jinping did also mention alternative proteins in a meeting of climate leaders subsequently a week later. So we think that there's some early interesting signs of interest from Chinese leadership in this space, but there's a lot more work still to do, which maybe you're sensing is a theme of every answer that I give, is that there's a lot more work still to do. So coming to the second question about India potentially leapfrogging conventional protein and factory farming to alternative protein, I used to say the word leapfrog so often in external facing meetings and talks that we had a leapfrog jar in our office that I would put in 10 rupees every time I said the word leapfrog externally, right? I use the word less now, because I think that there actually is a huge move to scale up, unfortunately, industrial animal agriculture in India as well over the next decade. But I remain optimistic that what we can do is build from the ground up very rapidly in a country where we can actually, as I've said earlier, integrate into the agri supply, set a very high bar for nutrition for these products, and really tackle some of the issues that are very relevant to the global south as well. So really have an operating model or an ethos around alternative protein in a place like India that reflects the unique challenges of the global south: undernutrition, farmers' welfare, farmer incomes, etc., which can build a very resilient and secure alternative protein sector moving forward as well. So I think a leapfrog is a very ambitious target, and I think we should set ambitious targets. But I'm not so sure we'll actually be able to leapfrog animal agriculture, unfortunately, with the way things are going. So we'll grow alongside it, is my prediction here.
Thank you. Well, thank you all three of you for an incredibly passionate and interesting discussion, certainly quite different from the usual alternative protein discussions I usually attend. So it's interesting to have the philosophical view and kind of the supply chain view and the design of supply chains from Temple has been really interesting. So really appreciate it. I'm gonna thank you also to all the attendees for joining us and for some really fantastic questions, especially the two students, really love those. And I'm gonna hand it over back to Tony to conclude this wonderful panel.
Hi everyone, yeah, and as Sanela said, thank you so much for all the attendance, but we're not ending right here. So please allow me to pass the time to Dr. Justin Robertson from City University of Hong Kong to say a last few words. Justin, please.
Thank you. Let me say three things in conclusion. The first is, Varun, we really did hear the sounds of Mumbai. We went from traffic outside to a bird at the end, very calming. So we had the full spectrum. Before you, I have a slide where I'm just highlighting a few things. So if you would like to go deeper into the work of our three panelists, here are some pointers for you. One of the best ways to learn more about Varun's ideas would be to look at his op-eds. He's a good op-ed writer. You can go to firstpost.com to see more of Varun's work. Temple recommended that I read her book, Temple Grandin's Guide to Working with Farm Animals. You could do the same. Of course, if you want video, her life was played out on the big screen by Claire Danes. One reviewer opined that, quote, Temple Grandin turns out to be the kind of biopic Hollywood rarely makes anymore. It's positive, revealing, and surprising. An intelligent period piece without sex or violence that's virtually free of profanity. My response is, come on, Temple, a bit of swearing is okay.
Oh, let me tell you, I won't repeat some of the words said in a job trailer out on a construction site.
Okay. But
Let's just leave it at that.
Viewers clearly like the film. It has an IMDb score of 8.3. For Peter, Why Vegan? The book would be a good starting point. I would also like to recommend an academic article of Peter's. The question he sought to answer is a fascinating one. How much does taking a philosophy course for a student actually affect their behavior? So he and his colleagues did this in a scientific way, using a control group with University of California students, and you can look at the review of philosophy and psychology to find the results. The last thing I'd like to say is that if you have any suggestions of speakers or ideas for future events, please do send me an email, or you could also respond to the questionnaire that we will send out tomorrow, along with the video of today's event. Thank you once again, and back to Tony for a final goodbye.
Once again, thank you so much for all the attendees, the three heavyweight panelists, and Sonali for the amazing event. So before we go, please allow me to thank Rabobank, the sponsor of this event again. And if you want to follow the three author on different social media, on Twitter especially, please go ahead and do it. And CityU, the Future Food series, also has a Twitter account, so feel free to go give it a follow, and we will have more amazing event coming up. So everyone, enjoy the day. Hope you guys learned a lot from this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. See you.
Thank you, Sonali, as well. Excellent job moderating.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Sonali. Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
you,
Temple
Peter.
and
Thank you,
Varun.
Temple. Thank you, Varun, and thank you, Justin.
Okay, everyone.
Antonio.
Justin.